Anyways,
Church members say the garden is same.
yes, they do. So, plan for today is we're going to discuss a somewhat interesting passage from Hebrews in chapter 11. That's what we're going to do concerning Moses and faith. Next week, we will get started on the actual book material for Lads to Leaders. So it'll be the more usual, I'm up here with the book and running through it, and we'll have slides again, things like that. No slides today, though. It's just, I want to just focus on the content. Just keep it a bit simple today. I was hoping Terry would be here because what we're talking about is kind of his idea. But he's not, so I have to pick someone else's brain as we go along. I'm having trouble finding what I'm looking for. It's right over here. So before we get into any of that, Nick, will you open us up in prayer, please? Thank you.
Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for giving us a place to come and worship you and learn about you. Please don't speak with us here. You lead us in class, and may we be able to focus on the things that you provide for us. And Lord, may we use this to make our own families better and bring others all around the world to you. It's your name we pray.
Amen. Okay. Okay, what did my notes don't make sense all of a sudden? Oh, okay, got it. So, we've been discussing how God is different, how our God is not like any other God. And we had looked at that a bit at Mount Sinai, how in the midst of giving his commandments, the Israelites made a horrible choice and decided to, because they got bored and weren't sure what happened to Moses, they told his brother, hey, make us an idol so we can worship like the Egyptians do and all the other nations, and they do so, and God's like, I'm going to wipe them out. Moses talks him out of it. I believe God is actually testing Moses just as he's testing the Israelites. But God does not wipe them out, thankfully. Instead, he's like, okay, well, we'll just start over again, and and he spends the next several books giving out the law. What happens is God's goal, if you read through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, this might even be in Exodus, God is consistently telling his people, you are not to be like the nations around you. Now, his law is going to be similar to that when it comes to certain things like sacrifice and maybe, certain things about murder and things like that. But the biggest difference is God, unlike all the other religions around in that era, God does not demand child sacrifice. He doesn't want any human sacrifice. And that is what's going to set the Israelites apart from all the other nations around them. And to go along with this, to remind us, just as the Israelites were under a form of a covenant, we are as well. And now it's a new covenant, same God, different covenant. And Charles Spurgeon, in my one of my daily devotional I was reading a couple days ago, had written something here that fits perfectly with what we've been discussing about how God's covenant is different, how God is different. So the key verse, so this was Genesis 9:15, I will remember my covenant. That was God speaking to Noah after putting the bow in the cloud. In Hebrew, there's no word for rainbow. It's literally a bow. So when they say a bow, they think of an archer's bow. But note the form of this promise. God does not say, and when you shall look upon the bow and you shall remember my covenant, then I will not destroy the earth. But it is gloriously put not upon our memory, which is fickle and frail, but upon God's memory, which is infinite and immutable. In other words, it cannot be changed. It cannot be disformed. I know we don't use the word immutable very often anymore, so. This is Spurgeon. He was writing in the 1800s, very British, so. When the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. It is not my remembering God, it is God's remembering me that is the ground of my safety. It is not my laying hold of his covenant, but his covenant laying hold on me. Glory be to God. The ramparts of salvation are secured by divine power, and even the minor towers, which we could imagine being left to man, are guarded by almighty strength. Even the remembrance of the covenant is not left to our memories, for we might forget, But our Lord cannot forget the names of those whom he has graven on the palms of his hands. It is with us as it is with Israel and Egypt. The blood was upon the lintel and the two side posts, but the Lord did not say, when you see the blood, I will pass over you, but when I see the blood, I will pass over you. My looking to Jesus brings me joy and peace, but it is God's looking to Jesus that secures my salvation, that of all his elect, since it is impossible for our God to look at Christ, our bleeding surety, and then to be angry with us for sins already punished in him. It is not left with us even to be saved by remembering the covenant. There is not a single thread of human effort in this fabric. It is not of man, neither by man, but of the Lord alone. We should remember the covenant, and we shall do it through divine grace, but the hinge of our safety does not hang there. It is God's remembering us, not our remembering him, and hence the covenant is an everlasting covenant. So in other words, as I said before, when it comes to covenants, generally you'd have there'd be two copies. It's like perhaps when you signed your contract for work. You have a copy that you take home, and there'd be a copy probably also over, in the HR office somewhere. You can think of it kind of that way. God in his case with the rainbow is like, well, you're going to be able to keep this part of the covenant, so I'll just keep it myself here. Now later on, he's going to say, okay, with Abraham, with the second covenant he makes with him, he's like, okay, I'm going to give you a sign so that you'll know who my people are and you won't be able to lose it, which is male circumcision. Because again, if you forget or lost your sign of the covenant, the person that was on the other end did not have to honor it. And same with the Ten Commandments, God essentially says, I don't need a copy of this, so you can take this other tablet, like the first tablet, and just put them in the ark or someplace else. Because God does not need to remember, God does not need to see the sign to remember. He knows. And now when he looks at us, he doesn't necessarily, those of us that have been baptized, he does not see a sinner. He sees either his son or someone covered by his son's blood. Because again, there is nothing we can do in terms of working to earn our salvation. And that also is why God is different, because every other religion requires you to work to earn your salvation. Whether it's so you can be reincarnated as something better and maybe eventually reach nirvana or something else, depending on if you're a Buddhist or a Hindu, whether it's so you don't have to be squeezed to death in your coffin like the Muslims believe. Essentially, if you haven't done the 5 pillars of Islam throughout your life, I don't know what the Jews do anymore to get their salvation, since animal sacrifices aren't there. I should ask her to look that up. But again, there's nothing we can do to earn our salvation. We earn it by grace through faith. And then God takes us from there. So, faith. Hebrews 11:23 through 29. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Okay, it goes on to talk about Joshua and Rahab and others, and then the writer of Hebrews is like, I don't have time to talk about everyone. It finally occurred to me, something's irked me about this passage, and I finally got it while I was reading that. And I'll get to that in a moment. So, because here's the challenge. When we look in the account in Exodus, there's not a lot of indication of Moses' faith in certain ways of going, I don't want to be I was raised in the palace, I don't want to be here. There's nothing to really that directly tells us that. We have to infer things. And I think in my mind, the problem is that I tried to infer it too early and it should be inferred later. And I'll get to that in a moment. There also might be, I consulted a couple commentaries about this because again, it seems so, the information is so out there from what we're given in Exodus. Just as earlier when the writer of Hebrews tells us Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead, and there's nothing in Genesis to tell us that. I mean, Abraham takes the long way around to get up Mount Moriah. It's not like he's rushing up there and going, well, I know Isaac will come back from the dead, so I don't have any concern. No, it's there's other stuff going on here. But Larry?
Well, the first 40 years of Moses' life, he grew up in the
Yes.
palace there thinking he was somebody. The next 40 years, he was forced out into the wilderness.
And there's the,
he was nobody.
yeah. And that's the key right there. When Moses initially leaves Egypt, he's forced out because he killed an Egyptian and people found out about it. But when God says the people that want, and God says that when that first Pharaoh's dead, Moses could have came back and claimed his spot. And that's what I just realized. It's not on the first leaving where Moses was leaving by faith. Moses was running. Moses was scared. It's the second, it's the return and saying, I'm going to lead these people out of here because God told me to, not I'm going to go and get my old place back with my stepbrother. I think that's where it is, and I think we lose that sometimes. And part of the challenge is that the writer in Hebrews here is not working exactly chronologically with events. It's kind of going back and forth because he's talking about leading out of Egypt, but then he mentions the Passover. So it's not always, they don't always write chronologically. That's what gets us hung up sometimes. We expect things to happen as like A happened, then B, then C. And that's like A happened, and then C, then we go back to D, then jump over to F and go over, The Gospels do that all the time. If you were to look at Matthew, Matthew a lot of times just took a lot of Jesus' teachings and sermons and just stuck them all together in these big long sections. And Luke does something similar as well. Mark's is more straightforward. John's just its own entity. So the challenge here is figure out then where Moses' acts of faith are, because again, it's not like he just says, I'm going to Egypt and bring the people out, because he's saying, God, anyone but me for this. But at no point either are we seeing him say, I want to go back to Egypt and be back in the palace and things like that. So something must have happened to him in those 40 years in the wilderness of Midian with the sheep, which essentially is really ironic if you think about it, because he essentially ended up doing what his forefathers had done, which was caring for sheep before they went to Egypt, and what they did briefly while in Egypt before they became slaves. So there's some other ways we can look at how we get to this too. These statements that don't always initially make sense. There is a Jewish rabbinic tradition called Midrash, which essentially is stories that they kind of make to fill in holes. They are not divinely inspired. Some of them are really interesting. Some of them are potentially what could have happened. Some of them are just off the wall. I won't get into any of that because I'm not qualified to. But, it's more used as teaching to make a point than necessarily to say this is truth or this is how we got here. Because they're not concerned necessarily about how things happened. They're concerned about why they happened. We look at the how a lot more than the why. So to break this apart a bit, I'm going to start with commentary from George Wesley Buchanan. This was written in the 70s, so this was when documentary hypothesis was still was the rage at the time. Larry's like, no, don't go into that. I'm just giving it some context. Hey, what were the interesting things in here? I didn't want to write in this book because it's not mine. I should have written these notes better. Okay. So I will say one thing, a lot of commentators will essentially say that for Hebrews, a lot of what the author of Hebrews does is tries to equate what was happening to the people in the Old Testament to move it slightly so that those who were in the New Testament as Christians could understand it better. I don't know if that's always was really the case, how well those connections really are, and they might not always make sense to us. They might have made more sense to them, but I didn't really mark anything out of these too well, did I? It's like you ever read something and you kind of get a couple things from it, but it just doesn't really connect. That's what I was getting from these commentaries, unfortunately. But verse 26, which had been, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. All right. How is Moses to know of the reproach of Christ? I don't have a right or wrong or good answer for this, okay? So if all you've got is stares, that's all I have in some ways too, because I don't think this is a case of him having more knowledge than we had, than having extra knowledge at the time. I mean, he's going to meet God, face to back at some point here. God's going to give him a lot of private instruction. But this is before a lot of that. Remember, God tried to kill him on the way to Egypt because he hadn't been keeping the covenant, keeping the Abrahamic covenant, the sign of the covenant. So Moses has some maturing and learning to do. Moses, remember when he gets to Egypt, he's like, okay, Pharaoh, let the people go. No, the people tell Moses, we stink in the sight of Pharaoh now. He's making more life worse for us. God, you said you do all this. You said you bring this out. And God's like, be patient. Just do this. Keep trusting me, and you'll get out. Larry?
They say hindsight is 20/20.
Yes.
The writer of Hebrews is looking back
Yes.
at the life of Moses. And certainly as Moses went through life, there were, it may have been indications that he was looking by faith and that God had.
And you know what? It just occurred to me. I love it when I keep looking at these things, I'm like, I just don't get it, and then I get up here and someone says something, all of a sudden I get it. So that's why I like teaching. Maybe Moses did so. Abraham had been looking for, Abraham was given a promise about, being a nation, mighty nation, things like that. He was told that his descendants would get the land. Did Abraham ever actually get to have the land as his own? No. But he followed the promise. Did Moses understand the promise of the idea that it's not that even though they're going to a physical land, that in the long run it's really more of an eternal time of an eternal land per se of salvation that God's leading them towards, albeit years in the future? Probably not. But by choosing to not to remain in Egypt where he could have, he's choosing instead to be looked down upon, to be thought of as less than as the other Israelites were. Now, and I don't know how long he's there in Egypt during the time of the 10 plagues. I don't know if this takes, probably a couple months or something by the way it seems. But he's definitely notice that it just occurred to me that Pharaoh says that Pharaoh is equating Moses with the rest of the Israelites when he comes back. He's not looking at Moses as his stepbrother anymore. He's looking at him as just another Israel, as one of the leaders of the Israelites. So Moses is looking for the reward, even if he does not understand what the reward is. He knows to look for it. And that's as true for everyone else in the Old Testament listed in Hebrews 11. They're looking for a specific reward that they don't necessarily understand or will even be able to receive until years later when Christ is crucified and rises from the dead. And during that time in between, that's when they find out, they understand. That's how I think it went, at least. I could be wrong. Interestingly enough, the writer of Hebrews here, which this points out that, again, another pointer to potentially being Paul here, is going to quote from the Psalms. Psalm 89, from verse 26, essentially, or somewhat equating with verse 26. So Psalm 89, 50 through 51. Now, if you were reading from the, now there are certain Hebrew Bibles where this would be Psalm 58. Did I say Psalm 89? Did I say 59? Psalm 89, verses 50 through 51. Apparently, the Hebrew Psalter has a slightly different numbering system because I think one of our Psalms is cut in two or something. So in some things it might say it's Psalm 88, but for us it's Psalm 89, verses 50 through 51. For context, this is a maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite. No clue who that was. I mean, we know Moses wrote, where a couple of the Psalms have been attributed to Moses. This is not one of them. But verses 50 through 51. Remember, O Lord, how your servants are mocked, and how I bear in my heart the insults of all the many nations, with which your enemies mock, O Lord, with which they mock the footsteps of your anointed. So this is being quoted somewhere there in Hebrews 11:26. And verse 25. He considered the reproach of Christ greater, so the mocking essentially, and looking for the reward. The author of Hebrews takes the words, the insult from verse 50, and the words, the Messiah from your Messiah in verse 51, and put them together in such a way as to apply to the Messiah Jesus. Just as being badly treated with the people of God, Hebrews 11:25, was contrasted to having transitory enjoyment of sin. Transitory would mean, temporary. So the insult of the Messiah was contrasted to the treasures of Egypt, although it is unreasonable to think of Moses as anticipating the Messiah in pre-kingdom times. This is the author's opinion, not mine, okay? Again, we don't know. This did not disturb the author. Not only was he able to apply Psalms to Moses, he also assumed that Moses foresaw the Messiah Jesus and acted accordingly. Like other covenanters, he believed that all prophecy applied only to the days of the Messiah. The chief motivation for ethical behavior for the author of Hebrews was the reward involved, which was the promised rest, receiving the promises or acquiring the inheritance. This was the reward Moses had in mind. In order to acquire possession of Canaan for the sons of Abraham, Moses was willing to leave the treasures of Egypt and accept instead the insult of the Messiah. So, yes, Nick?
The sins doing wrong, going against God, that's going down to the third and fourth generation. And so also understanding that they are initially, choosing gross sin, those sins are going to carry down for multiple generations. So you better choose God.
Yes, and it's not necessarily the sin itself, I think, that can carry down, but the repercussions of that can. Because if we traumatize our children, then that can carry down from them down there, just as if we're traumatized, just as we've been traumatized by our parents or grandparents, something like, maybe trauma. Trauma is a perfectly fine word to use here, I think, and I know it gets thrown around a lot, but essentially, yeah. Our words and actions have consequences, and sometimes we don't see how far that they can actually go because we are so wrapped up in the immediate here and now. And in the case of the peoples that will be in the same land as the Israelites, God will say up to a certain generations they cannot enter the holy air, they cannot enter, come near the tabernacle. Once a certain amount of generations have passed, then they can go in. Except for the Egyptians. They are not permitted, the Egyptians were never permitted into the tabernacle. They probably weren't even permitted into the temple. Once Cornelius and his family were visited by the Holy Spirit, then they'd be welcome in, as with everyone else. But, and again, and it is because of how they mistreated the people when they were in Egypt, the Israelites. So that sin is passed down for many, many generations there. And we never see anything about Egyptians coming into seeking favor or anything. Even Solomon, whose first wife that's mentioned is the princess of Egypt. She has to have her own separate house because she can't be around Jerusalem, part of Jerusalem. So Solomon's going to get that right and then forget everything else, essentially. And we laugh, but that's unfortunately what's going to happen. And we'll probably talk about that here over the next several months. So, to continue on here, I've got about 10 minutes left. One thing to remember, though, Moses is not meant to be the permanent establishment for of how salvation works. So even though he is acting through faith, it is not Moses that brings about salvation. Hebrews 3:1-6. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later, which would be the new covenant. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Got a footnote here. Some manuscripts insert firm to the end of verse 6. I have the ESV here. Okay, where are we going with this? My notes don't make any sense again. I have to say, I'm thankful to whoever was using this other commentary previously, because they left a nice bookmark sitting in there for me to put elsewhere. I will return this to its proper library later on and put this right where I found it, so if they ever decide they need it again, they can come back to it if they remember where it was. But for today, thankful it's there. Okay, so this is another commentary on Hebrews. This one's more recent. It's from 2001, 2002, from also, its binding's not in the best shape, which is weird considering it's a newer book. From Craig Kester. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. If I had the dust jacket, I could tell you who and what he does, where he's from, but I don't have that information. I didn't look it up, and I should have. This is 2001. Okay. So what did I want to talk about in this one? I can't read you ever write something down and you can't read it afterwards? Yeah, that totally happened here. Well, I can read that. I have something here from Numbers 12:7, which I think is reminding us of God reminding everyone that Moses is faithful. Now, was Moses perfect? No, Moses made mistakes. Bring at Numbers 12 here briefly in verse 7 to remind. So this is when I'll just start at the beginning here. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. All right, that's a very interesting way of, he had married because of the Cushite woman who he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Just to let you know, he married a Cushite woman. And this was a problem to Miriam and Aaron. No one else seems to care, but they do. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. That's an interesting way to describe Moses. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him. In a vision I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. In other words, this is where the Hebrews 3, right? Hebrews in chapter 3 is like Moses was faithful. God saying, Moses is faithful to me. He is my servant. And also, why should Moses' choice of wife have anything to do with who God chooses to speak to and who he doesn't? Because Aaron and Miriam don't get it at this point, and I don't think we'd get it either from the beginning. So, now the Israelites were God's chosen people. But it was possible, unless you were Egyptian or from one of those 7 nations that were to be destroyed, it was possible to become as the others were, become as the Israelites. God made very clear ways on how to do that. So from the beginning, even though, salvation was to be of the Jews, of the Israelites, God intended everyone to come in. So Moses marrying a woman from Midian should not be a disparage on him at all, because it's God's way of saying, hey, I'm bringing others in. Rahab was not an Israelite. She's brought in. She's in Jesus' genealogy. You don't mention a woman in a Jewish genealogy unless she's important. Ruth gets her own book. And again, she's mentioned as well. That doesn't happen unless you are important, or very important, like so important that you have to be mentioned. Because was Ruth an Israelite? Was she Jewish by birth? No, she was a Moabite. I think it was a Moabite. And the Moabites came from Lot in Genesis 19. And the Moabites and the Israelites generally were not on good terms, because when the Israelites were wandering, the Moabites tried to kill them. They failed. And they lost their land to Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, who were like, this land is better for our type of livestock than what's over there. So if it's okay with you, we'll stay on this side of the river. And the Israelites were like, no. And God's like, if you help them get their land, fine with me. And then we never hear from them, and they help get the land, and their story can go back, and we never hear from those tribes again. So something happened and they got assimilated, or something happened to them. But all right. So okay, that was the author's thing there. I'm still trying to figure this out. Okay, I got 2 minutes left here. All right, Terry, we've been discussing that statement from Hebrews 11 you wanted to talk about Moses and faith in Jesus. Is there anything you want to add to this, since this was your idea?
Well, I'm sorry that I wasn't here earlier to hear that, so I can't add to it, but it's just a good thing to think about.
Yes. Yeah, so what we discussed was that even if Moses didn't understand what the true reward was, which would be salvation and eternal rest, that he was still aiming toward that. And we also looked at how it wasn't on Moses' first leaving of Egypt that he did in faith, but upon his return to Egypt, when he was no longer a wanted man, that he chose to be with the Israelites instead of being part of the Egyptian royalty. Now and again, remember, God is going to spend a lot of time trying to get Egypt out of the Israelites and trying to get Egypt out of Moses. And he's not going to get all of Egypt out of Moses. Hence when Moses strikes the rock twice instead of speaking to it. And in some ways, God spends a lot of time trying to get Egypt metaphorically out of us, because we can be just as stubborn and stiff-necked as the people that left Egypt a long time ago. So what's going to come up next is we're going to start on the book itself. And with that, I will record these sessions we'll be having, these lessons. I will not be posting them to the church's YouTube, though, or to my YouTube, until after all of the 2027 conventions have happened, because it's technically copyrighted material, and I don't want to be trampling on the author's feet until the work with it is done. If that makes sense. So if you miss something, you're gonna have to wait until probably May or June to see it. It's just to be fair to the authors. Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve.